All right, got a bit of a doozy to talk about today, but first things first. The video that I said I was going to make, and then everything happened, and I haven't had time to get to it. I'm going to be moving in 3 months internationally, and one of the things means moving my library, and freighting it is far and away the most affordable option, but unfortunately it's going to take a long time, which means that I have had to pack all of my books and ship them, which means I do not have access to the overwhelming majority of my library. The only thing that I really have left, aside from a few special Murakami novels that I'll be taking with me on the plane, are mostly books that I'm not really sure whether or not I wanted to keep them or donate them. I split roughly half of my books into a donate pile, and some of these books are like International Booker Prize long-listed or short-listed or winners, or books from a culture where I wanted to kind of try and read more books by them, or things like that, where they're not things that have been immediately on my list, but something that I've wanted to get to, or something that I got because I want to get to it at some point, but that point has never come around, and I figure this is a really great time to send all the stuff so that it's there for me when I get to where I'm going, and in the interim I can read through some of the books that I got this sort of way, with the exception of I did break my no buying book rules to get A Night in Chile by Robert Belano, which will be the next thing I review. So that'll be the one exception. Otherwise, most of these books should be just odd pickups that I have no idea if I'm going to like them. I don't know really heads or tails about them, except for something at one point or another made me think, yeah, I should probably try this. Which brings me to today's book, which is Whale by Cheon Myeong-kwan, translated by Cheon Kim, and it's a 2003 longlisted for the International Booker, and it was Korean magical realism, which is what made me pick it up, though it's a family saga in a similar line of Pachinko and 1,000 Years of Solitude. Or is it 100 Years of Solitude? I don't know. I can't remember. But anyway, and the thing is, like, I liked 100 Years of Solitude, and I liked, well, I didn't actually much care for Pachinko, to be honest, but the thing that I really take issue with, personally, in terms of the old "it's not for me" argument, is the way that these saga books cover so much time that they really take a distant view and a very descriptive view, a very tell type of view, where even the dialogues are almost never really dialogues. It's just so-and-so said something and they exchanged words about it. And this book is also guilty for that, and I can't get connected to things when everything is so distant, when I can't feel a real connection to the characters, and everything is just so summed up. It feels like you're reading a summary of something rather than like a story that you can really get invested into. At least for me, I prefer a more active voice. But that said, if that doesn't bother you, and I know that doesn't bother you, bother a lot of people, and to be fair, I did still read through this book pretty damn quickly, given the time constraints that I had, and like I said, I did enjoy 100 Years of Solitude, but this particular type of storytelling really chafes me badly, so it's more liking something in spite of it. And one of the things I would also say when it comes to whether or not I recommend this book, the last 100 or so pages, the last part of the book, it's divided into 3 parts, gets really, really dark. And in a way, it frustrates me because I like some of the things that it's saying with it. I like some of the things that it's doing with that last part, but it feels very emotionally manipulative in the way that things are just so shitty for this one character that, like I said, it starts to feel like my emotions are being toyed with, especially since earlier on, there's a sort of undercurrent of comedy to some of the things that are happening. But God, the last 100 pages are just so vindictive, and it just doesn't feel in keeping with a lot of the rest of the book and what happened to that point. So what is this book about? Well, really, this is the story of, and I'm probably going to butcher the names, but I'm going to try, Gyeongbok, who is a woman who leaves her village at a young age and sets out into the world. And she tends to be successful at businesses, and it's about how she kind of moves from one place to another until finally she ends up in a small city called, I think it's Pyeongdae, and how she builds Pyeongdae from this very small place into a modern powerhouse. And even though I call it a saga novel, there's this sort of accompanying curse by an old crone, and the story, especially in the third part, picks up with her daughter, Chunhui, and after something happens to Gyeongbok, and the story ultimately concludes with Chunhui. And it's really supposedly very satirical and covers a lot of Korean history, which is another one of those situations where some of the stuff I picked up on with my limited knowledge of South Korea's history, some of the stuff I didn't, and I definitely think you would get more out of this book if you are aware of the history of South Korea, because there's definitely a sort of, in much the same way that you could say about both Pachinko and 100 Years of Solitude, there is that look at not just characters. In fact, like I said, it's very, very distant about its characters, because really the story is more about a place, a setting, characters as metaphors for ideas and ideologies and things like that. And that, if that sounds interesting to you, if you liked Pachinko, if you liked 100 Years of Solitude, then go ahead and give Whale a shot. I'm not super surprised that it didn't gain some of the reputation that like Pachinko did, but I still think that that there's something there for fans of that type of storytelling. So, like I said, would I recommend it to those types of people? Absolutely. Pros and cons. Like I said, I already mentioned the writing style being something that I chafe against, but when you're trying to tell a certain type of story, I wouldn't call it a con, because again, like the story is trying to be very large, and if you were to go in and fill in all of the dialogue and the conversation, or get into kind of the details and the nitty-gritty and the stuff that I kind of look for in writing, then you would end up with an 800-page book minimum. And while I personally don't mind 800-page books, especially if I'm really engaged in them, I can read an 800-page book that spans a month and be content. Some books go for a micro scale, some books go for a macro scale. It's not about right or wrong. I just personally prefer more micro-focused stories, and that's not what this is. But for what it is trying to be, I think, like I said, I still think it struck a good enough balance that I did get engaged and I did read it, even if it didn't go quite as far or in depth as I wanted it to. One thing that I will say is a con, that I won't kind of hedge myself pro or con, is, like I said, the abrupt tonal shift at the end. Before that, it feels weird to talk about the book as a satire, because I only understand it as a satire because I read the inside cover and it describes itself as a satire. And it doesn't really necessarily And the only like really sort of funny parts to me are a few lines that are very Vonnegut-esque, kind of asides to the audience, or reoccurring statements or phrases put in different contexts that end up being funny for the repetition. So, for example, this is the law of such and such, is a phrase that gets repeated throughout the book, and sometimes it's dead serious, like this is the law of love, or this is the law of men, or this is the law of women, or whatever. But then just as often it'll be used to throw a monkey wrench in things, like this is the law of capitalism, or this is the law of mass appeal was a pretty good one. And there are like funny moments like that, but on the whole, the kind of first 260 pages, while there are dark parts to them, it's nothing compared to the last 100 pages. And I really think that the tonal shift is so abrupt, and the things that happen are so shitty that it's not even a matter of it being realistic or unrealistic, because I absolutely believe that this kind of abuse went on within the prison systems. Not to get into major spoilers, it says right at the start of the book, within the first few pages, that she's being released from prison. So to actually see her description and her experience, but it's also just, I can't really go into it more with spoilers, but so suffice to say, it's one of those situations where everything that can go wrong does go wrong, and it starts to just feeling absurd and unfair. And life can be that way, but when you're writing a story and you're in control of the story, it just kind of feels a bit cruel as a writer. Like you're unnecessarily trying to stab at me as the reader, or to make me sympathize by making everything so shitty for this particular character, especially when the character herself is as innocent as she is. So that's kind of a shitty aspect to it. But to balance it out with a pro, I will say that the story is very compelling. The writing doesn't really capture my attention or my imagination. And in fact, I thought it was extremely dry at first, but at the same time, I could go on and just sit down and read 50 pages in a sitting easily, in a go, which it is its own kind of accomplishment to have that kind of prose that fades to the back and doesn't get in the way. So it's worthy of acknowledgement. The prose doesn't get in the way or impact or distract from the story. If you're looking for prose that does elevate the story, then definitely you're not going to find it here. But I think that the prose itself is fine. And I think that there's a certain level, as shitty as the things that happen at the end are, I think one of the pros of the books is the way that it doesn't shy away from making bad things happen to good people and making good things happen to bad people, because when you're looking at the development of a nation, particularly one that has gone through as much as South Korea has, then, and most of my knowledge of South Korean history is, stuff like it was controlled by China, then it was controlled by Japan. Then post-World War II, you had the Korean War and the conflict between communism and capitalism. So it is an island, or not an island, it's a peninsula. That's really dumb. It is a nation that has seen a lot of conflict. And even to this day, the divide between North and South is so steep that even though for a long time reunification was always seen as the goal, it's being drawn into question as to whether or not that continues to be the aim, or even should continue to be the aim, given how much they have split apart in the time that they have been separated. So, nation of big conflict, and that's to say nothing of the rapid technological changes and societal changes where they've undergone hundreds of years of modernization, modernization, westernization. There's a huge conversation to be had about that particular verbiage. But the point being that if you think that life has been changing so much in a lot of what we call first world countries, which South Korea has absolutely become one, but what has happened for us in the past several decades and years happened in South Korea much, much quicker, and to this day is causing a lot of challenges because you have older generations whose ideologies are literally from a different era still alive and butting up against younger people. And that's not to say anything of the even younger people being born into this hyper-competitive, hyper-capitalistic structure, which is to say that there's a lot of conflict going on in Korea. And I think that even though I don't know a lot about it, the book made me want to go and do some research and learn a little bit more about it, which I haven't done, unfortunately, because I've just been too damn busy. I haven't even been able to make the brief 2-minute I'm moving and can't take all my books with me video. Then again, I've also been reading, and that's the thing that I want to make really clear about the story is, as busy as I have been, every time I have sat down to read it, I end up reading way longer than I intended to. Because there is a gravity and a compelling something to this book, even if I can't quite put my word on it. It's just, like I said, interesting to see what is going to happen next to these characters, because, operations that usually in a book would be all about setting up this one operation or this one business. The main character, Gyeongbok, goes through several businesses, and some of her operations fail, and some of them succeed, and some of them end up being a completely a different type of success or failure. And I think one of the interesting things about this book would be conversations as to whether or not Gyeongbok, by the end of it, can be said to be a good person. The narrator's voice, and I guess I'm moving into themes. So, moving into themes, one of the things that, like I said, I find the question of Gyeongbok as to whether or not she is a good person to be interesting, because the book has a narrator's voice. It is told as a story being told to the reader, and the voice refers to this divide where Gyeongbok, at one point in the story, since we're in themes, full spoilers, becomes a man. Her clitoris grows, and it becomes like a penis. She starts dressing like a man, and the pronouns in the book switch to he. So Gyeongbok is effectively a man at this point, which also represents the transition into a completely selfish character, or so we're told by the narrator. And yet, Gyeongbok's attitude towards Chun-Hui throughout the entire book is absolutely abysmal. The way she treats some other people like Moon is absolutely abysmal. It talks about her kind-hearted previous self, specifically as a woman, and it's like, okay, but while she could be kind in some ways, she could also be an absolute ass in others. And at the end of the day, she was a business person first and foremost, and almost never made investments in things just for the sake of it. She did occasionally for some people, but for others, she wouldn't budge unless she could get something in return. And as I mentioned in my Shadow of the Wind video, I did the little trick where I thought about her as a man and tried to see, am I really being critical of her because she's a woman behaving like a man, to the point where eventually she becomes a man. And I find myself thinking, no, I genuinely do not like this type of person. And I find it interesting that the narrator is doing such a insisting that she is this sort of charitable person, or that she was this charitable person, when I don't see that at all. Another thing that I find interesting about the story and would enjoy discussing with a group beyond is the sort of magical realism elements of the story, because this is similar to 100 Years of Solitude in the sense that there are light magical realist elements, but I think 100 Years of Solitude goes a lot harder in it, and I liked the way the 100 Years of Solitude kind of incorporated the magical realism into the story more. But that said, I like the the magical realist elements that there are to Whale, but I also can't help that, much like with 100 Years of Solitude, how much of the historical aspect that I'm missing out on in understanding the metaphors, because, for instance, Chun-Hui can speak to... The flap says she can speak to elephants, but there's only one elephant that she speaks with, and I don't know if there's something in Korean particular culture that relates to elephants. There's another character that is able to communicate with bees, and I don't know if there's some kind of myth associated with bees that might be tying into this. So there are these interesting elements to the story, but I'm not entirely sure that they're adding a whole lot unless there's this entire layer to it that I'm missing out on. But right now I'm just kind of talking about sort of deeper thoughts about the book rather than explicitly themes. But the closing of the book, because God, okay, there's so many themes. Let me. I guess I should just get into this proper. There's themes of capitalism, and there's themes of the corrupting effect of capitalism. Like I said, with Gyeom-bok, who is always a businesswoman, but who gradually becomes more and more obsessed with it, to the point that she ends up becoming a terrible person and becomes the arbiter of her own downfall through her greed and corruption. There's themes of death and how Gyeom-bok spends her entire life running away from death, despite causing a lot of death and destruction and mayhem in her wake. And at the end of the day, the one thing that she sort of overlooks is in her whole existence, which is running away from death, is her daughter, and how her way of making of avoiding death is to make big things. The book literally says at one point she makes big things in order to because big things outlast small things. So she wants to make something bigger than herself. And this is one of the other themes of the book, is kind of history and how you're remembered by history, because then you end up with her daughter, who she completely ignores, and yet who come the absolute very end of the story is the figure that ends up historically remembered and becomes a bit of a national icon, albeit even that ends up bastardized both by the churning of the rumor mill and inaccurate history and the way that memory changes over time, but also by commercialism and adapting the story to make it more appealing retroactively. But Chun-Hui ends up being the one of everyone else in the story, of Pyongdae itself, the entire city, by the end of the book is not just a ruin, but has been reclaimed by nature. And it's only these bricks that they really put their time, put the effort into making right, which this is again where Gyeom-bok, despite investing in the brick house and choosing Moon to oversee it, is pushed really hard against Moon, looking for these bricks, this specific way of making these very special bricks that last, and this sort of quality artisan brick that ends up standing the test of time, outliving both Moon and eventually Chunhui, and is the thing that of everything that Gyeongbok does, is the thing that she ends up being remembered more so than she herself. So, this is where I think the kind of macro scale of books like this ends up coming into play, because you can have something like Anna Karenina, where you have a micro focus on a very, not turbulent, but a kind of changing point in history, where you're examining a ton of different ideologies and how those ideologies are coming into conflict and the effects that it has on people and the consequences of that. You could also look at Dostoevsky's Devils, or as it's called, The Possessed, as another example of that. And I like those stories better. They fit more with me. But in terms of talking about this broader scale of memory and how things are remembered, this is another way of approaching it that is perfectly valid. And I think that having it on this macro scale really lets you appreciate just everything that Gyeongbok went through and Pyeongdae went through. Like, you get to see not just her journey, but the rise of this city, and then not just the fall of this city, but the complete reclamation of this city by nature, to the point where later on in the story, when it cuts to the latest point in the story, and it's not even following Chunhui anymore, the city is completely overgrown. It's not on a map. Nobody can find it. The only reason that they're able to find the city is because they eventually find, and mind you, they go on a national hunt for this city. It's a Secret Service hunt, but like the secret police force or the Secret Service, whatever, are using their resources to try and find the city, and they can't. And this was once a major city at one point. Gyeongbok, as a man, brushed shoulders with many influential politicians, and his downfall came from insulting the general, who is like kind of the supreme leader himself. So to see this city that was really a technical marvel, and all the things that it brought into the world and these people's lives, be reduced to nothing and to be not remembered, is kind of really thematic of, like I said, not just memory, but what gets remembered, what ends up lasting, how the things that in the present seem big and important can end up really forgotten as history goes along, but also how the things that we the sort of, like I said with the bricks, the fact that they persevere with the bricks and really make these quality bricks, and literally you could take it as like the building blocks of society. They worked hard, and it was the workers who made these bricks, not Gyeongbok. And even though Chunhui eventually kind of gets remembered in the way, it's through the sacrifices of the workers making these bricks, through the refusal to settle for the business acumen of Gyeongbok. Although, and again, this isn't to deny Gyeongbok the credit, she did finance it, and she did, once it started taking off, move her home there and work very hard to support the brick making facility. But it's sort of through this perseverance to make quality things that stand the test of time that paradoxically that you reasonably end up with the bricks that do build societies, build cultures, and last. And there's something to be said for remembering the brick makers and whatnot. And along with this theme of memory and this sort of theme of escaping death, is also a theme of Western influence, not just in the capitalistic sense, but through movies in particular, and how Gyeongbok is increasingly influenced by movies, and increasingly spends more and more time looking at movies. And when they first opened the Whale movie theater, it mentioned this belief that all things from America are beautiful, which, as an American, is absolutely laughable. But it's important to look at the, as an American, difference between the culture that you put out and how other cultures look at that and perceive your nation versus how you perceive your nation from the inside. I say this as somebody who lives in Japan, and we all know how Japan's culture and like anime and whatnot, anime video games are viewed by the outside world. And I can tell you, living here, it's obviously very different because reality is different. And that's not to say I don't enjoy it here, but it's just that gap, and how as Gyeongbok goes on, he spends more and more of his time in the theaters, becoming escaping reality. It's really a way to escape his mortality as much as anything else, and how it's in a theater where he ultimately meets his demise. So there's also that sort of escape, that attraction to a fantasy of a movie, which it's not critical of in terms of, going every once in a while to escape the challenges of life, but it's the absolute dependency on the fantasy when it starts to supersede reality, and how this obsession allows Gyeongbok to be taken advantage of, and ultimately is one of the biggest places and impacts of her downfall. All right, my throat is completely giving out, so I'm going to cut this here, and join me next time when I talk about Robert Bolano's By Night in Chile. I'm not sure which. I'm going to look that up. So see you then, and I feel like I've been kind of negative on Whale, and that's because I don't know how much I'll remember this book. And like I said, the last 100 pages were really heart-wrenching, but heart-wrenching in the way that I'm going, okay, but I'm feeling a bit emotionally manipulated and whatnot. But it really is, like, the fact that I enjoyed it as much as I did, despite it being not the type of book I would ordinarily read, I think is a huge point in its favor. And like I said, if this is the type of thing that you like, if pachinko, like I said, interests you, pick up this book. Give it a read, please. I encourage it. So yeah, see you next time.